1987 got off to an incredible start for the collective might of Enix, Chunsoft and Armor Project. Even though Dragon Quest II had undergone what could only be described as a hellish end to its development, with large portions of the game having to be redone in just a month, they did the best they could, and both Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura braced themselves for the unending vitriol of consumers who were sure to be angry about them releasing an unfinished and unbalanced product. But the opposite ended up happening. What they'd done to extol the virtues of the role-playing genre over the past year had worked, and Dragon Quest II resonated with their audience in spite of its increased difficulty. Sales ended up surpassing anything they thought possible pre-launch, and it led to a shift in mindset about what they thought could be done next. With 2 successful launches under their belts, they no longer had to prove the viability of the genre. So their focus shifted instead to exceeding expectations and pushing the genre as far as they could, not least because they were acutely aware that their success was going to inspire a wave of creators who sought to take their crown. This is the story of Dragon Quest III. Making Dragon Quest II had proved to be a Herculean task for Yuji Horii, Koichi Nakamura and the rest of the team. Within half a year of releasing the original game, Chunsoft and Enix had developed an entire sequel, continuing their endeavour of introducing role-playing games to the ever-expanding pool of Nintendo Famicom players. For the second game, they expanded ambitiously upon the original, introducing bigger battles and a grander story. And yet, despite effectively having a running start, the team ran into numerous complications while attempting to surpass what they had already achieved, and were forced, at the last moment, to delay the game's release in order to rebalance the entire experience. Their 7-month whirlwind of development ended up with a dramatic and taxing conclusion, and Enix were so unsure about how it was going to be perceived that, after the last-minute delay, they cut their sales expectations nearly in half, from 700,000 copies down to 400,000. But the hard work paid dividends, and once Dragon Quest II actually went on sale in January of 1987, it became an instant phenomenon. The ensuing Dragon Quest craze saw over 1 million copies sold in Japan within a month, and it far exceeded what had been achieved with the original game. Such success cemented the series and the studio's reputations, and it proved that Dragon Quest was not a one-trick pony, but also that the genre was more than viable on home consoles. Other game studios quickly began to take the potential of role-playing games more seriously. Throughout 1987, this saw several publishers attempt to break into the genre on the Famicom. Each attempted to follow Dragon Quest's lead, but brought their own distinct approach to role-playing, like Megami Tensei, which combined a dark vision of the real world with Ultima-style dungeon crawling, or Final Fantasy, which provided an original perspective on the traditional Dungeons & Dragons classes. It meant that while Dragon Quest had opened the eyes to Famicom owners to a new genre, Enix was no longer the only publisher bold enough to navigate its waters. As the industry reacted to their success and new competition began to emerge, Horii and Nakamura felt they had no choice but to rise and meet it. But this wasn't just because of a need to stay ahead of the competition and remain the pioneers. It was also because, despite everything they had achieved with the first 2 games, they still felt they hadn't fully realised the game they originally dreamt of when starting down this path. Dragon Quest had set the stage and introduced a new wave of gamers to the complex concepts of role-playing games. But its one hero versus one monster approach proved to be somewhat repetitive. Dragon Quest II upped the ante, introducing more playable characters, more enemies, and a deeper world. But this ended up making the game considerably harder than anticipated, and they still had to make compromises along the way. This meant they still had ideas they wanted to bring to fruition, and this made the 3rd Dragon Quest game a necessity if they wanted to fulfill their vision, while also ticking the box of satiating the appetite they had created amongst their audience, not least because consumer expectation was now to be at its highest point. To live up to their own pedigree, the hypothetical Dragon Quest III therefore had to be bigger and better than what came before. So if Dragon Quest II had been twice as fun as the original Dragon Quest, then Dragon Quest III would have to be 4 times as fun. Before heading into the specific development of Dragon Quest III though, I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone who has supported the channel so far. we set up Datalog with the mission of chronicling the history of role-playing games, initially through the lens of those developed in Japan, and it's honestly been incredible to see how much that mission has resonated with everyone. Each series is told in chronological order, but there's also room for one out-of-sequence episode. This season, that means a bonus episode on Generation 1 of Pokemon, which is live right now for Patreon supporters, and will be live before the end of the year on YouTube. Next season, we're going to allow all Patreon supporters, free or paid, to vote on what the next out-of-sequence episode should be for Season 2. So, if you'd like to be part of helping this channel to prosper, feel free to head over to patreon.com/datalog to learn more. With that though, let's head into the development of Dragon Quest III. After achieving their goals on Dragon Quest II, the team opted to take a different path forward this time around. This meant, unlike previously, where they went straight into development before even being given the green light from Enix that a sequel was on the table. This time around, even though the team was enthused about the prospect of making another sequel, the beginnings of Dragon Quest III were a little slower. Dragon Quest II's month-long delay had led to an absolute marathon of playtesting and revisions, with new builds being checked multiple times daily by the end of this period. It meant the entire team, not just Hori and Nakamura, were suffering from severe burnout, as well as the psychological pressures of putting out a game to market they weren't 100% comfortable with. It meant that while the pair had aspirations to make another game, so as to close out their unfinished business, they weren't in a position to even begin pre-planning until Dragon Quest II was finished and out the door in December of 1986. But when the dust settled, they just wanted to try and recuperate. Hori, for example, ended up collapsing from a stomach ulcer that had formed due to all the stress, and Nakamura even considered quitting the games industry. There were also changes in circumstance, as even though Nakamura got on well with Hori, he had founded Chunsoft in 1984 with a small group of childhood friends and peers from university. But by the time Dragon Quest II had finished, most of the original group had moved on to positions at bigger companies, with some even leaving the video games industry. As a consequence, Nakamura also considered disbanding Chunsoft altogether due to it just not feeling the same. But those doubts subsided post-launch after he saw the response from fans. When considering all of these aspects, instead of immediately starting a third back-to-back project, the Dragon Quest team decided to take some time off over the holiday period. And in the new year, they planned to travel to a hot spring resort in Hakone for a team retreat. The intent of the trip was simple: to unwind, regroup, and celebrate their accomplishments. But the exhausted creators just couldn't stop themselves from starting to brainstorm their next game, especially given how, at the same time, hype was beginning to swirl ahead of Dragon Quest II's launch at the end of that month. The company retreat, thus, was the backdrop for the first planning sessions of Dragon Quest III, as team members discussed the things they wanted to achieve. Because as far as they'd pushed the Famicom already, there were still ideas they'd left on the table. And from the discussions that took place at the hot spring, some of Dragon Quest III's most defining features were outlined. First, they wanted to expand the playable party once again, this time to a nice round 4 characters. And while Dragon Quest II had given players a static party, with 3 descendants of Erdrick, each with defined characteristics and abilities, Hori wanted Dragon Quest III's party to be much more malleable. This would see the main character continue to act as the player's avatar, while retaining the hero class like in the previous games, and being able to use a mixture of physical and magical abilities. But this time, players were given the option to either choose a male or female appearance. The remaining 3 party members were then to be generic blank slate characters decided entirely by the player. They could be hired as allies from an adventuring company in the starting town and assigned one of 8 vocations or classes. Some of the classes were then to be aligned with classic fantasy archetypes like the warrior, mage or martial artist, with a few more unconventional choices mixed in to spice things up. But even these would still have roots in traditional classes seen in the likes of Dungeons & Dragons, Ultimate or Wizardry, just with their own distinct identities. Should players wish to change their party lineup, they could then hire a replacement or, better yet, reclass their existing character. And they hypothesized about creating a special location that could offer this service a little later in the game, while also wondering about the potential balancing issues. This led to them making the provisional decision that respeccing a party member into another class should return them to level 1, with half their stats, something that should, theoretically, allow them to reach higher heights once they leveled back up, essentially giving dedicated players the chance to create the hybrid classes of their dreams, like warriors who could heal in a pinch. The main character, however, was to be exempt from this process, expected to carry the physical hybrid and magical hero class for the entire game. The last key feature to arise from this initial planning session was the day-night cycle. On this point, video games, regardless of their genre, had rarely explored this space in a meaningful way. But just after Enix's staff retreat in January, 2 other games attempted their own take on the mechanic. Taito's Kikikai Kaidohen on the Famicom Disk System, a reimagining of an arcade shoot-'em-up where a timer tracked the in-game date, and Castlevania II's Simon's Quest, which cycled between day and night every 6 minutes of real time, changing NPC and enemy behaviours. Both of these mechanics were neat, but the idea conceived for Dragon Quest III in its earliest planning sessions was slightly more complex than either. That was because the time of day would alternate with every 120 steps the player took outside. At night, enemies would appear in different formations and become more powerful or aggressive. While most townsfolk would retire into their homes to sleep, and other locations would be outright inaccessible. This meant it was not planned to be a simple visual gimmick, but a legitimate mechanic that impacted gameplay and quest progression, with some tasks requiring the player to visit certain locations at night. They felt such ideas had the potential to revolutionise the console role-playing genre yet again, and after being energised by their retreat, Hori, Nakamura, and the wider team returned to their offices to get to work on Dragon Quest III, just in time to see Dragon Quest II launch on the 26th of January 1987. The unexpected leap in popularity then redoubled the team's commitment to delivering a strong third game, because the expectations and the potential felt higher than ever. But for them to deliver, they first had to come up with a compelling scenario. This was the foundational element, and after the success of Dragon Quest I and II, Hori was adamant that whatever came next had to be not only bigger, but also more fun. He had worked hard to make sure the scenario of Dragon Quest II was better than the original, but now he had to do the same again, and this time he knew it was going to be even harder, since they wanted to increase the scope significantly. Following the Hot Springs retreat, Hori spent the entire month of February drafting the story. From the outset, he was adamant that Dragon Quest III should retain its silent protagonist. This was because Hori was very passionate about the act of role-playing as part of the story, and this meant, in his eyes, that if the protagonist spoke, it would ruin the illusion, making the player believe they had no actual agency in determining how the story progressed. The supporting cast was simply there to add flavour alongside the rest of the world. Fortunately, this philosophy intersected well with the concept they devised at the retreat, where the player could fill their party with up to 3 hand-picked allies. Thus, the story was planned to focus on a young hero who embarked on an adventure to stop the Demon Lord from destroying the world. But where previous games had focused on a hero descended from a famous warrior named Erdrick, Dragon Quest III's hero was the child of Ortega, a warrior who had been given the same quest many years prior but was presumed dead. This approach refreshed the formula they had previously used, while still having a familiar weight of lineage and responsibility on the player's avatar. But Hori also wanted to introduce another aspect that he felt would be revolutionary, and this was to have the game's world mirror the layout of the real world, while also reflecting its variety of cultures. This meant most of the locations in Dragon Quest III's world map corresponded to a real-world country, and were placed in roughly the same place on the map. The country of Japan, for example, resembled Japan, and it was found far to the south of Mur, the in-game counterpart of Eastern Russia, named after the Amur River. Some other references ended up being just as obvious, like Romeli for Rome and Portugal for Portugal, while others were a little more oblique, like the Immigrant Town, which could have been developed as a reference to the Jamestown colony in America. Once the original story draft was completed, the development team then travelled to Egypt in March to get inspiration for their globe-trotting main scenario idea, particularly from the town of Ibis, the in-game parallel to Egypt. Upon their return, full-scale development commenced in earnest, and throughout April, Hori got started crafting the game's maps, while Nakamura began work on the battle system. Coming up with the scenario was only the beginning though. The real challenge was ensuring that the scenario came across as intended, bringing it to life through all of its aspects, such as its characters, playable, non-playable or antagonistic, but also its maps, dungeons and even naming conventions. To this end, Hori opted to expand the scenario team even further, as there was just too much work to do. He'd taken a similar approach with Dragon Quest II, leaning more heavily on his Shonen Jump colleague Hiroshi Miyaoka to help him out. Miyaoka then returned for Dragon Quest III as scenario assistant, but he was now joined by a new hire named Kenji Yanagasawa. With such an ambitious scale, drawing all of the game's maps took the team over 2 months. And by July, the scenario team shifted to working on the NPCs, placing them on the maps, staging events, and writing their dialogue. Around the time the maps were finished though, Hori had a moment of creative crisis. He had always been adamant about wanting to be the first to do something, and if other games launched with features that they were planning, thus beating them to the punch, he'd rather cut the feature entirely to avoid any comparison. This then caused significant issues when an RPG called Mirai Shinwa Jarvis launched at the end of June. Developed by Taito, the game was largely panned by critics, if not overlooked entirely due to a plethora of bugs. But Hori wasn't interested in how terrible the game was. He was instead focused on the approach they'd taken for their world map. Hori and Miyaoka had spent 2 months handcrafting all of the maps featured in the world of Dragon Quest III, recreating Earth from scratch. But this new game from Taito had featured the exact same approach, and Hori was mortified. His immediate reaction was to scrap the entire world map and create a new one, but as they were already a few months into development, this would have caused a massive disruption. Due to the nature of the proposed cut, Hori decided the best approach was to have an open meeting with the entire development team, and after some heated discussions, Hori was ultimately overruled. The team collectively decided that it was best to keep the world map as it was and swallow their pride. This, of course, was not what Hori had wanted, because their innovation had effectively been swiped away. But he did appreciate that the team would pull together to discuss such issues, and that they approached these problems from the player's perspective, imagining how users would react and be affected if the game was delayed significantly as a result. Ultimately, that was the deciding factor, that it just wasn't worth throwing out 2 months' progress, especially if they could compensate by making their vision of the idea as effective as possible. On the Chunsoft side of Dragon Quest III's development, Koichi Nakamura was acclimatizing to a new way of programming the game. Ever since the original Dragon Quest had shipped, he'd been attempting to gradually reduce his active contributions. This meant that, while he had programmed the entirety of Dragon Quest I by himself, for Dragon Quest II his output had reduced to around 50%. And for Dragon Quest III, he planned to reduce it even more, down to just 10%. This was because Nakamura felt it was beneficial for him to take on a more directorial role, as this would be befitting of his position as head of Chunsoft and of their programming department. However, by his own admission, his inexperience with delegation and leadership had contributed to Dragon Quest II's problems, and he was eager to avoid making the same mistakes again. His desire for a clean start after the gradual departure of Chunsoft's founding staff necessitated a changing of the guard for the programming team. Of the 5 programmers who helped contribute to the sequel, only 2 remained for Dragon Quest III, Togo Narita and Masaki Okono. This meant some new hires had to be brought to the table, and one of them was Kan Naito, who joined as chief programmer. The now 5-man team, under Nakamura's leadership, built the gameplay systems according to Hori's designs. Hori's instructions were often vague at times, as he'd just give impressions or images of what he wanted to convey, expecting the team at Chunsoft to then interpret that and deliver. Now that he had more time, it meant Nakamura felt more comfortable about looking for ways to fully enact these ideas and interpreting what Hori had intended in a way that could be achieved on the Famicom. Hori likened their arrangement to the relationship between a manga's artist and writer, one outlining scenes and one turning those ideas into reality. Dragon Quest III proved to be more demanding in this regard than ever, with larger puzzles, dynamic scenes, and more complex set-piece moments, such as the eruption of a volcano. The gameplay itself expanded significantly too. Compared to the relatively simple progression of the previous games, Dragon Quest III was exponentially more complicated, with 4 playable characters, many possible vocations, and the ability to swap between those vocations mid-game. But while the programming team was relatively new, they had the benefit of Nakamura's experience at the helm, and likewise, they knew that the players themselves were familiar with Dragon Quest conventions and playstyle by now, so felt they didn't have to work too hard to explain everything like they had to with the 2 previous games. With Dragon Quest I, for example, they focused on making the lone hero's level ups and new equipment feel like a tangible upgrade, to purposefully show RPG newcomers how the genre worked. And those concepts were expanded upon in the sequel. But after easing players in with 2 previous games, they now felt free to embrace a bit more complexity. This was also because, while other games on the Famicom had started experimenting with changing the formula when they made a sequel, like Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, Dragon Quest III was intended to still be familiar at its heart, using virtually the same gameplay system but expanding what was possible within it. The biggest factor working in the team's favour, however, was the introduction of battery-powered saves. Previously, programming the Spell of Restoration password system had been taxing on Nakamura. All the player data had to be saved to a string of characters, something that was somewhat manageable when there was only one playable character, but much less manageable when this was expanded to 3, as it saw passwords balloon from 20 characters to as high as 52. Adding a 4th character and expanding the story dramatically would have required absurdly long passwords, but the introduction of battery saves was like lifting a weight off their back, enabling them to do things they hadn't been able to do before. They also doubled storage capacity, facilitating the near tripling of available spells to a total of 62, with each spell also being given specific utility to reduce the amount of useless spells. Enemies were also given more focus, with their behaviour reprogrammed to feature more deliberate attack algorithms and logic. Simpler enemies still behaved in inefficient patterns, even attempting to use magic when they lacked the resources. But more sophisticated monsters and magic users were designed to be smarter, even stealing the party's MP to keep casting potent magic or reviving other defeated monsters. This not only helped keep the game balanced with more player characters, but addressed the potential monotony. There was even room for savvy players to add a little risk to their playthrough, for a substantial reward. The Gadabout or Goof-Off vocation was added as a sort of joke class. Male Gadabouts appeared like literal clowns, while female Gadabouts appeared in risque bunny suits, often holding alcohol in Toriyama's illustrations. The vocation had abysmal stats, and their main ability functioned at random, depending on their level, picking an effect from a list of antics which could help or hinder the party, or simply waste their turn. As a trade-off, they had indelible luck, sometimes dodging attacks or debilitating effects spontaneously. Taking a Gadabout was a risk, but players who managed to raise one to level 20 could then reassign them to the potent Sage vocation, a class second only to the Hero class, as it learnt magic associated with both priests and mages, while also being able to use most weapons and armour. Hori had intended Gadabouts to give the game character, but at Chunsoft's insistence, they were given a higher purpose, serving as a shortcut to the otherwise obtuse Sage class. The programming team spent most of the earlier half of development getting these systems in place, until Toriyama's monster designs were completed in full by September. Production then shifted into high gear, reprogramming monster attack patterns and digitalizing Toriyama's remaining designs, and playtesting began in good time as well to avoid mistakes of the previous game. The last defining feature of Dragon Quest III came about later in development. Once the hero had obtained the 3 magic keys, collected the 6 orbs, summoned the mighty phoenix, and slain the archfiend in his lair, players might have expected the game to be over. However, upon returning to their hometown, a bigger villain called Zoma appeared and opened a pit to the Dark World. And once the player pursued the true villain through the pit, they would learn that the Dark World was none other than Alfgard, the setting of the original game. Thus, Dragon Quest III revealed itself as a prequel to the first 2 games, taking place generations before the original Dragon Quest. As in Dragon Quest II, players could explore Alfgard all over again, and by the end, Dragon Quest III's hero, the Child of Ortega, was bestowed the title of Erdrick, becoming the legendary figure that players heard so much about in the 2 previous games. They hoped this would prove to be an earth-shattering revelation for loyal fans, but the origin of Erdrick's identity stemmed from a somewhat mundane restriction. In the ending of Dragon Quest II, the heroes travelled the world revisiting characters, a sweet footnote to the game that nonetheless added a lot of extra dialogue for the scenario team to write. As work on Dragon Quest III entered its final stages, Hori was already exhausted and daunted by the prospect of writing a comparable epilogue for an even bigger world, especially as all the game's dialogue was drafted by hand first and then transcribed digitally. Thus, he decided that the portal to the hero's homeworld would be closed with the final boss's defeat, sealing the party inside Alfgard, and perhaps more importantly, meaning that Hori only had to consider one world for the epilogue, saving time and storage space. Instead of checking in with a cavalcade of NPCs from the first world, seeds were instead planted to connect the 3 games together through their hero's lineage. Fortunately for composer Koichi Sugiyama, it had already been decided earlier in development that Dragon Quest III would feel like it took place further in the past. and this encouraged him to include more of a classical influence to his score as opposed to the touch of modern pop he had used in Dragon Quest II. However, despite being able to use a much larger capacity cartridge, the team once again ran into storage issues as development went on. Sugiyama had composed a separate battle theme for Baramos, which ended up being cut, and too late in development, he realised he should have included a special battle theme for an important scene in Ortega's story. An entire town was also removed from the map entirely, which would have served as a treat for longtime fans of Enix games. The cut town was meant to revolve around a murder mystery subquest designed to serve as an allusion to the Portopia serial murder case, Hori's first game after placing in Enix's software contest. Since Portopia's Famicom version was a first collaboration with Nakamura and had provided them with the experience to make Dragon Quest in the first place, it was meant to serve as a fun homage, but ultimately it was deemed too superfluous in comparison to other aspects of the game. Even with these cuts, the expanded Famicom cartridge for Dragon Quest III still ended up full to the brim of data, hitting 99.88% of its capacity, and leaving so little room that the title screen had to be trimmed off, reduced to a simple text box stating the game's name instead of a triumphant graphic. Nonetheless, on the 22nd of October, a fully playable build was prepared, ready for playtesting and polishing to get underway. And with no last-minute delays this time around, Enix was almost ready to complete the trilogy no one knew they were even making. While production on Dragon Quest III ended up far less tumultuous than Dragon Quest II, the development process ended up being noticeably longer. From concept through to shipping had taken 6 to 7 months for Dragon Quest and 8 months for Dragon Quest II, but Dragon Quest III had taken 13 months. It was a smoother and healthier process for all involved, leaving Hori also free this time around, but nonetheless, Dragon Quest II had inspired a wave of competition, and the long wait for its follow-up left the market open to those imitators. In the fourth quarter of 1987 alone, 6 major RPGs developed by Japanese studios hit store shelves. The throne was essentially left deserted, and the contenders came seeking it. To further complicate matters, Dragon Quest III, despite the extra time, was still not ready for its initially advertised release date. Enix had been publicising a release somewhere in December of 1987, but in early November, they finally confirmed a concrete date, the 10th of February 1988. While the delay was not nearly as dire as Dragon Quest II's, it was still a potential blow to the game's performance, especially with so many other options now on the market. In their review of Final Fantasy, which released on the 18th of December, Famitsu even claimed that no one was more pleased by Dragon Quest III's delay than Square. And indeed, if they had gone toe-to-toe with Enix, Square's fortunes might have changed significantly. Nonetheless, the advertising campaign started early and strong. Magazines like Famitsu published previews of Dragon Quest III and featured it on the cover for months before its original release window, with Hori himself supplying plenty of early game insight, alluding to the story and new gameplay features, and even answering reader questions. By the time of manufacturing, Hori was confident about the game's chances. While he'd felt uncomfortable about Dragon Quest II being published in a less than perfect state, Dragon Quest III in his mind was perfect. Producer Yoshinobu Chida was confident too, boasting to Nikkei Business Daily that this time will definitely beat Super Mario Bros. A lofty claim, given Nintendo's platformer was practically a household name after nearly 3 years on the market. And as the big day finally approached, it quickly became clear that neither the long wait nor the imitators could stop the perfect storm that Dragon Quest III had become. Enix prepared an initial shipment of over 1 million copies, much higher than the 2 previous games. And yet, in the days leading up to launch, even that seemed like it might not be enough to satiate the demand. Practically every retailer that sold Famicom games saw lines on release day, and the biggest line was at the Bit Camera location in Tokyo's Ikebukuro district, beginning at 3 PM the previous day, and ultimately spanning the doors all the way to Ikebukuro Station by the time the store opened on launch day. Over 10,000 people joined that one queue, and upon hearing that fans were waiting in such large numbers, Hori rode his bike down to see it with his own eyes, and felt sorry that so many people were waiting in line on such a cold day. There was even a concern that students would skip school to pick up the game, leading to the Tokyo Metropolitan Board of Education issuing a formal warning. Yet even with the warning, scores of students were mysteriously absent on that particular Tuesday. Many school-age fans in the line claimed they had the day off to observe the school's anniversaries, and over 300 students were taken into custody. The issues were so bad that the National Police Agency asked Enix to issue reservation tickets for students, allowing retailers to hold copies for them until a more school-appropriate time. And the incident led to a general restructuring of how and when popular games would be released. But the game's success, while great for Enix, brought out some ugliness from opportunistic retailers. It's unclear how widespread the practice was, but due to how much they knew consumers wanted to get a copy, they began refusing to sell it unless consumers bought a second game with it, in an effort to shift some of their less desirable software in the process. And once copies began to run out, there were instances of muggings occurring against those who had been fortunate, with a group of high schoolers allegedly shaking down a junior high student for their copy. Due to a combination of the good, the bad, and the unexpected, Dragon Quest III's launch went down in Japan's cultural history, a rare social phenomenon for gamers to reflect upon around that time. Once the dust had settled, Famitsu reported that Enix had sold 1.4 million copies of the game in its first week. It showed that Enix's decision to order so many copies had proved to be a prudent business decision, as Dragon Quest III had become the fastest selling game in the history of the Famicom. Over the next fortnight, another 676,000 copies were sold, with a further 368,000 being shifted in the 2 weeks that followed that. It continued to reign over the Famicom sales charts until it was eventually supplanted by Tecmo's Captain Tsubasa at the end of April. By October of that year, over 3 million copies had been sold. It was one of the best-selling games in Japan of 1988, ending up as the third best-selling Famicom game of all time. But it fell slightly short of Cheetah's boasts, as it ended up selling 40,000 copies fewer than Super Mario Bros. 3, which had also launched that year. These sales were no doubt boosted by major publications adoring Dragon Quest III. Famitsu awarded it a total score of 38 out of 40, their highest score of the year, proclaiming that anyone who owns a Famicom should definitely play it, and that Dragon Quest never disappoints anyone who's interested in it. The panel of 4 reviewers were impressed at how the series continued to improve and grow even denser. They wondered how it could feel so different from its predecessors while also using the same Famicom hardware and still feeling like a Dragon Quest game. Family Computer Magazine's readers then scored Dragon Quest III as a 27 out of 30, with particular praise given to its music and levels of engagement. This set the stage for similar returns outside of Japan, but due to how much time had passed and the underwhelming performance of Dragon Warrior 1 and 2, Enix opted to take a different approach when it came to releasing Dragon Quest III in North America. Instead of relying on Nintendo of America, this saw Enix take over publishing duties themselves. As per the 2 previous titles, it was to be named Dragon Warrior 3, and they implemented numerous changes to make sure the game adheres to Nintendo of America's strict policies. However, whereas Dragon Quest III was released on a 2MB cartridge on the Famicom, Dragon Warrior 3 was bumped up to a 4MB cartridge when it was released on the Nintendo Entertainment System, and thus the English edition was given a few extra bells and whistles. Like Dragon Warrior 2, Dragon Warrior 3 featured a unique title screen which helped to set the medieval tone. The name entry segment, which had been silent on Famicom, also featured the sprightly theme Intermezzo from Dragon Quest IV, which had already been released in Japan by this time. But that wasn't all. The title screen was updated to feature a brief animation showing the hero's father, Ortega, fighting a dragon atop a volcano, and this provided a hint to his fate that was not present in the original Japanese version. Ortega was also given new distinct sprites for the scene, and a later appearance where in the Japanese version he appeared as a reskinned version of the hoodlum enemy. Chunsoft's Hazuki Kurikara handled Ortega's redesign, which incorporated some elements of the blue armor that by now had become a staple of the Dragon Quest heroes. But Sugiyama's wish to have a distinct death theme for Ortega was also granted, as the haunting, funerary reimagination of the battle theme he'd composed was added in as a nice exclusive treat. From a gameplay perspective, either as a concession for English gamers or to rebalance the original version, Dragon Quest III was made more generous with battle rewards, granting 25% more gold and experience from all conflicts, and giving newly hired party members a set of basic equipment instead of forcing the player to buy them brand new gear. Once again, a considerable amount of effort was also put into localization, but it proved too little, too late. Dragon Warrior 3 was released on the Nintendo Entertainment System in March of 1992. A year and a half after Dragon Warrior 2, and with the 16-bit era already well underway. The Super Nintendo had launched in August of 1991 and quickly became a sensation, and its main competition, provided by the Sega Genesis, was beginning to thrive as well. At a time when Sonic the Hedgehog and Mario competed for the hearts of young gamers, a 4-year-old Japanese role-playing game for an 8-bit system held very little intrigue. As big as the series had become in Japan, in North America, Dragon Warrior was nothing more than a very niche title, and even with flashier, faster platformers stealing the thunder on newer hardware, a third entry in a struggling series was a tough sell in that market. Nintendo Power did try to signal boost it a bit, publishing a full strategy guide for the game, but they only published a mini review within their Power Meter section, awarding it a 3.6 out of 5 and acknowledging its dated presentation. Other publications, however, barely bothered to even register its arrival. Electronic Gaming Monthly previewed it a year prior to its release as one of the games featured at the Consumer Electronics Show, calling it Japan's favourite RPG, but they didn't do much else beyond that. Video Games and Computer Entertainment magazine was harshest, however. They lamented that it had no dragons to speak of, buried its plot twist under too much combat, and had a persistent flickering on screen. Generally, Western critics agreed that those who liked the previous games should probably check it out, but recommended that enthusiasts of the genre should just wait for the next Ultima. As a result, Dragon Warrior 3 did not make much of an impression commercially, continuing the series' diminishing returns in North America. It saw only an estimated 95,000 copies sold in total, which was a marked decrease on the previous game's performance. What had been a generation-defining event in Japan became little more than a whimper in North America, and Dragon Warrior 3 went underappreciated by its second market, for the time being at least. Over time, Dragon Quest III became a cornerstone of role-playing in Japan, and for video games as a whole. The sheer scale of its launch highlighted that video games were not just some toy or a passing fad. They had the potential to be a social phenomenon, as much of a cultural moment as the release of a new hit movie or album. For role-playing games, it arrived like a prophesized hero, fulfilling the promise of the RPG boom and signaling the transition of the genre into an essential corner of the market. For the development team themselves, Dragon Quest III was also an absolute win. They walked away feeling they'd finally achieved what they'd set out to do with the first game, and this time, it had pretty much launched in the way they wanted, and with the reaction they wanted. Since then, Dragon Quest III has often been named the best game in the series in official fan polls, winning the honour from Famitsu at both the series' 15th and 20th anniversaries. But the fanfare started not long after launch. Just like with previous games, there was a symphonic suite performed. This time, however, the NHK Symphonic Orchestra's performance won the Special Project Award for New Children's Music at the Japan Composers Association Annual Awards, becoming the first video game soundtrack to be recognised by a musical awards show. In 1989, the game's plot was then loosely adapted for an anime series called Dragon Quest Legend of the Hero Abel, which ran for 43 episodes. There was even an English localization attempted by Saban Entertainment, but it was abandoned after just 13 episodes. In addition to the anime, Dragon Quest III also received a companion manga called Dragon Quest Emblem of Roto, which helped to bridge the gap between the third and first games. But despite Dragon Quest's connection with Akira Toriyama and Shonen Jump, the manga was illustrated by Kumi Fujiwara and published by Enix's own publication, Monthly Shonen Gungan. The comic was successful enough in its own right, though, to spawn an animated film adaptation, which released in 1996. That same year, Dragon Quest III received a Super Famicom remake just like its predecessors. The 16-bit edition added a new thief vocation, with them designed as fast fighters who could pick up items after random battles, and had utility abilities for exploration, such as checking a chest's contents before opening it, finding the nearest town on the world map, or reducing the encounter rate. New personalities also helped to dictate how a player character's stats would increase over time, adding another layer of strategy to party planning. While a host of quality of life improvements were also added, including features introduced in subsequent games to help with overall playability and familiarity to those who had come into the franchise after the original release of Dragon Quest III. Ortega's expanded story from Dragon Warrior 3 was also introduced to Japanese players for the first time, as was a bonus dungeon awaiting daring players who cleared the game. The dungeon set players on a side quest culminating in a visit to Zenithia, a familiar location from later games, before setting up a confrontation with the divine dragon Zenlong. Defeating this super boss multiple times, and in fewer total turns, could then impart 3 different boons, including reviving Ortega and returning him to Alahan. The 16-bit version was not ported to the Super Nintendo due to a combination of factors, including the original game's reception, the arrival of more sophisticated hardware like the PlayStation, and the closing of Enix's American office. But in Japan, it proved to be a successful endeavour, with almost 1 million copies sold, something that placed it as the 29th best-selling game released on the system in that region. Dragon Quest III was then remade again in the year 2000, this time for the Game Boy Advance. And a North American localization was also sanctioned, perhaps due to the reduced financial risk. This version was scaled down in terms of almost every aspect of presentation, but it still had all the content from the Super Famicom version, plus new monster medals. This saw monsters killed last in combat having a chance of dropping a medal as a prize, and collecting multiple medals ranked them up from bronze all the way to gold. Collecting bronze and silver medals was key to progressing through the Ice Cave, a new bonus dungeon that led to a new super boss called the Grand Dragon. Given that the Game Boy Color relied on batteries, the handheld remake also incorporated the ability to save anywhere. And even though it was released late on in the console's lifecycle, this newest remake ended up selling another 600,000 copies, something that positioned it as the 29th best-selling game to release on the Game Boy, but the 5th best-selling Game Boy Color game. And by the time Square and Enix had merged, Dragon Quest III had managed to sell almost 6 million copies across all its versions, making it the best-selling game released in Japan across the company's combined portfolio, and only behind Final Fantasy VII and VIII in terms of global performance. For 2 decades, additional ports and emulations followed, updating the game for Japanese smartphones, the Wii, the PlayStation 4, 3DS and Nintendo Switch, while not really adding much in terms of gameplay or features. But during the series' 35th anniversary, Square Enix announced the Dragon Quest III HD 2D remake as the first major reworking of the game since 2001. Square Enix producer Masaki Hayasaka had been interested in remaking the original Erdrick saga, since they had not been truly remade for a modern system since the Super Famicom, and he felt that Square Enix's HD 2D style, introduced through Octopath Traveler, offered the perfect compromise, and Hori agreed upon hearing the proposition. To give the remake something distinctly original, Hori also suggested a new vocation, the Monster Wrangler class, which had originally been introduced in Dragon Quest X, while head of Creative Studio 5, Tomoya Asano, suggested that a hard difficulty mode should be implemented. Character customization was greatly expanded, as well as the abilities of most jobs, while the scenario was fleshed out to give its characters more impact and agency, now accented by voice acting in battle and for major cutscenes. Ortega's story was also expanded again alongside the post-game content. Hori was ultimately impressed with the results, particularly with how the HD 2D visuals truly allowed the world's regions to come alive, reflecting their real-world inspirations. While not causing the same kind of hysteria as the original release, Dragon Quest III HD 2D's launch in November of 2024 was another great success for Japan, selling over 800,000 physical units in its first week on sale in Japan across the Switch and PlayStation 5, and within a month, it had sold 2 million copies worldwide. The global success of the Dragon Quest III HD 2D remake has given the game a new chance to shine with audiences old and new, and this became especially true with international audiences. Just as Hori, Nakamura and their team had dreamt of almost 40 years prior, their creation has continued to introduce new generations to the fun of role-playing games, and maybe it's helped them to see a little more magic in the world as a result. But that was not the end of the road for this dynamic team, as even though Dragon Quest III had closed one chapter in their book of creative endeavours, another was just about to begin. But with that, thank you so much for watching, everyone. My name is Darryl, and together with Colin and Chris, we hope you enjoyed listening to the incredible development history of Dragon Quest III. Hopefully, as you watched through the video, you found some interesting nuggets of information that perhaps you didn't know before. If you did, then please consider showing us how much you appreciate the effort that's put into researching, writing and editing this video by giving it a like. We're also incredibly thankful for the support we receive on Patreon. Patreon supporters get ad-free early access to history videos like this one up to a week early. But if you sign up now, you can also get early access to our first out-of-sequence episode, which is all about Pokemon. You can find out more at patreon.com/datalog. Alright everyone, with that, this is Darryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon for more RPG goodness.